Welcome to a conversation on race, privilege, and justice. I'm Pastor Tom Clark of Hebron Salem United Methodist Church, and I join today with clergy and laity throughout the United Methodist denomination in talking about the very important issue of racial justice in America. Social activism is not new to Methodism. The founder of Methodism, John Wesley, called us to know that faith is reflected in works, and works of mercy. Wesley also called us to preach beyond the pulpit, which he did often. And that means we need to preach in the communities and preach in the streets and preach to the issues that affect the people. So today we're going to be talking about white privilege, what it means, how it affects racial injustice, and how we as a church can respond. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Daniel Lackey of the Maryville School Corporation. We look to Dr. Lackey for advice, insight, and information. And so I welcome you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I would begin with a very basic question. Dr. Lackey, what is white privilege? How would you define it?
I would define white privilege as not being aware of what privileges you experience because of who you are and how you navigate your life through the interactions that you have based on someone who doesn't have white skin. It doesn't mean that if you're white that you haven't struggled, that you haven't faced challenges. It just means that for some folks that don't have white skin, there are some systemic experiences and personal experiences that they have because of being of a different hue that a person that's white may not ever have to experience. And again, that does not negate anybody's individual experience. And that doesn't negate anybody's individual successes. Just because you're white and you're successful doesn't mean that you didn't work hard. But what I am talking about is there may be some systemic pieces in place that you may not be aware of that has allowed you to progress in ways that someone of a different hue may not have had the same kind of opportunities. And the privilege piece comes into play when you have the privilege of not having to even be aware of those differences.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent definition and a very apt starting point for our conversation today. I would say that many people understand white privilege as it has been reflected legislatively. We talk about things such as exclusionary zoning, voter suppression. We talk about those things that are cast in law and public policy. But I think you're talking to a deeper level of privilege. That's almost an unconscious sense of privilege. Would you agree with that?
Yes, yes. I just think that on a personal and systemic, because it's both wrapped together, that we're just not aware of how our privileges benefit us until it's brought to our attention. And I'm going to use it by comparing it to other privileges that we may be a little bit more aware of. Gender privilege, the fact that as a male, whether it's right or wrong, or whether it's me not being realistic, I believe as a male, I have the privilege of being able to walk out of a supermarket at 11 o'clock at night and walk to my car and not be concerned about having to watch my back. As a female, leaving the store and late at night in a dark parking lot going to your car, you don't have that privilege. There is a concerted fear of, is anybody behind me? And that doesn't mean that someone can't come behind me as a male and that could turn into an issue. But I'm telling you, as a male, I have the privilege to not have to be worried or concerned about that, in which in society I think females do. That'd be an example. As an able-bodied person, I don't have to think about how I'm going to get up the stairs and open that door to get into a certain building. But if I'm a person who has a disability that involves my ability to be mobile, then that's something that I have to think about. So when I talk about privilege, again, it has to do with how we navigate in our lives, not having to think about how that navigation may be burdensome for somebody else.
That's a tremendous insight, because it really comes down to what we talk about when we say the power of normalcy.
Mm-hmm.
What privilege grants is this sense of normalcy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very intrigued by one of the articles that I reviewed that you had forwarded, an article by Corey Collins on white privilege, where it talks about the three kinds of power and privilege.
Mm-hmm.
The power of normalcy, power of benefit of the doubt,
Mm-hmm.
and the power of accumulated power. Could you talk just a bit about that, and power and white privilege?
I think the power of normalcy is when you look at a situation and you just consider it normal, and you don't understand that that might be normal for you but not for someone else. I mean, the classic example of that in contemporary terms would be people's perception of police officers. You know, in some communities, the police officers are perceived as to protect and serve. They see them as being an ally. They are comfortable. They aren't worried about anything going amiss in their interaction with the police officer. That's that sense of normalcy. So if I believe that, and someone else has a conversation with me that has a different experience, you know, I'm going to say, well, what's the problem? Why are you concerned? You have no reason to be concerned. Mm-hmm. That's because my sense of normalcy about that relationship is very different from that other person's experience. And when I don't recognize that that other person's experience with the same entity may be different, then I'm denying that person the opportunity to be recognized as having a different experience. So I am applying my sense of normalcy on someone else, and when I do that, I'm oppressing that person in the process.
Very interesting, and I think it bears some further discussion regarding the role of police,
Mm-hmm.
regarding the role of police and white privilege, because often, as we've looked at this past year of some tragic encounters,
Mm-hmm.
people of color and police,
Mm-hmm.
and many times though, if your relationship with police has been, quote unquote, one of your normal interaction with police has been one where servants protecting and serve,
Mm-hmm.
a positive interaction with police, does that not create a sense of insularity
Mm-hmm.
from some of these events that we are seeing, some of these events leading to tragic consequences?
Absolutely, it's a different relationship. It is a different relationship. I can tell you on a personal note, and just as a black male,
Yes.
that I have had experiences with police that have unfortunately left me guarded. And when we see what's happened in society as of late, I will acknowledge that when I'm driving my car, if there's a police officer behind me, there's a level of anxiety. And it's not that I'm doing anything wrong.
Correct.
It's just that because of, you know, my experience with police and people that look like me,
Mm-hmm.
and what I've been taught as a child growing up, that it's automatic that I need to be on guard and be wary. I mean, that is built into me. That's part of the imprint that's been placed on me by my parents and my grandparents. I can hear my grandmother saying to me in my ears, you know, if a police officer comes, make sure you say, yes, sir, keep your hands out of your pocket. I can just hear the talk.
Okay.
And it comes from a history, a legacy of where policing, back in the day when it was a lot more overtly racist than it is now,
Right.
where those experiences from my ancestors have definitely influenced, good or bad, in terms of how my experiences are framed with police. Because I'm aware of that, I think one thing that I can do is I can acknowledge that and separate that out and not let that interfere with my own personal relationships with folks that I know that happen to be police officers.
Okay.
But I would not be honest with you if I didn't acknowledge that that history is with me as well.
That's very interesting. Talk a little bit about that history. Is that a challenge that we face when we look at this issue of white privilege, where that history does not necessarily exist for those who have benefited from a privileged social location?
Yeah, one of the examples I will use is George Floyd. Okay. When folks saw George Floyd being killed by a police officer because he placed a knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Correct.
The society was horrified. They were shocked. They could not believe that this was happening in America in 2020. And what I will tell you is that the majority of African American people were not shocked. Okay? And it's because people who haven't had the same kind of experience with policing, that's not their normalcy.
Correct.
They were genuinely horrified.
Correct.
And that was real. And I think as a result of that, we had a lot of protests where when you would see who was protesting, it was extremely diverse. And in some communities, almost all white.
Correct. Correct.
And so what I would say to you is that, again, some folks had the privilege of not having to be aware or recognize the societal inequities in terms of how black people are policed and brown people are policed as compared to white people. There is a huge latitude between the three races. And that is documented. I mean, back in the day when Barack Obama was president and Ferguson happened, they looked at the data, and the data was collected by the Ferguson Police Department, and it clearly showed huge inequities in how brown and black people were being policed in Ferguson versus white people. It was very clear.
Absolutely, and I believe the majority of the population in Ferguson were people of color at that time. And yet the policing practices were disparate and clearly were not geared toward equal protection.
Correct.
One of the things that's interesting, and because we see this in Ferguson, we saw it in Kenosha, we've seen it in all of these instances where there have been these very tragic and very horrific instances where black men and black women were killed. And then you talk about the protests that were predominantly composed of white people in that instance. And if I understand you correctly, you're saying that's because there is a sense of insularity, so those events would strike them as particularly tragic and out of the norm, a violation of their normative frame of understanding police work. How do you think that affects public policy then? How does that impact public policy with regard to policing?
Well, that remains to be seen, because historically there's not been a whole lot of movement on that. I mean, it's been slow. And I think that's because those in power who have the ability to be able to promote those kinds of changes have been met with a lot of resistance over the years. There has been progress. Clearly there has been progress, but not enough, because we still have a ways to go. And I think that we go through these periods where the pendulum swings both ways.
Correct.
And I think right now we're experiencing some backsliding in that area. I think that 5 years ago we saw some progress. In the last 3.5, 4 years we've seen some backsliding in that area. I think that one of the positive things that has happened out of all the tragedy we've seen in the last couple of years in terms of policing and people of color perishing in police custody has been the fact that there is a push. I think, to be very blunt, white people are becoming woke, if I may use that slang, and being more aware that, things are extremely unequal when it comes to how black people are treated when it comes to policing. And, more people are seeing it, and they know that our policing needs to be fixed.
I think that's
more and more.
I think that's true, and I think that's true in many areas of public policy. Some time ago, a book came out entitled White Fragility. And the basic theme of that book was that many times white people or white communities are reluctant to talk about questions of race. In your experience, why do you think that is?
I think in our society, we have equated racism and behaviors that are associated with racism as people being horrible, okay? And that's not accurate. The reality of it is that some of the most genuine people who mean the best behave in ways that are racist. So we need to quit vilifying people who, for whatever reason, have been brought up in an environment and have been conditioned to think a certain way about certain groups of folk. I think it's more about, you know, starting where people are at and helping them move forward in their becoming more aware of the value of differences rather than being fearful, because I believe that that's where it comes from. I think racism and racist behaviors among folk come from people being fearful of the other, the different, that difference. And so if we can, you know, help people work through their fear and to really see that difference as something to celebrate and to see it as an asset rather than a deficit, and as something welcoming rather than a threat. And I think then we can really begin to alter how we coexist as a human species. And I just want to say for the record, race is just, that's something we made up.
Social construct.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I'm going to just be plain. It's something that we made up to be able to categorize people. It has no biological foundation to it at all. It truly does not define who we are as people. You talk about culture and cultural heritage, that's different. That has some meaning, but race does not. And I think that we've taken it and as you said, we made it a social construct in a way that has not been equitable and beneficial.
No, it has not. And you make an excellent point, because really what we're talking about here is how we have defined those we characterize as the other.
Mm-hmm.
There is absolutely no biological basis to race, and I would underscore that point. It is one thing we have to come to grips with,
Mm-hmm.
that we cannot define people as other. We have to define people through their common humanity and our common humanity. But one of the interesting takes from that book, White Fragility,
Mm-hmm.
is the normal response when a white person, member of a predominantly white community, is asked about race.
Mm-hmm.
They will inevitably respond, well, I like people of all color, I get along with people of all color.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make any difference to me. But the reality, and I think you're bringing this out very clearly, is both consciously and unconsciously, there are these applications of white privilege
Mm-hmm.
that take place.
And another way to describe that is a bubble.
Yes.
You know, you're living in a bubble, and that bubble is very comfortable. In order to be able to understand that other people walk in a different way than you do, and engage and are experiencing life differently than you do because of who you are, whether it's because of race, or gender, or ability, or sexual orientation, or religious affiliation, that those differences impact how we walk in life and how the world responds to us, both positively and negatively. And when we talk about it in the context of race, there's a whole history in America where race has been used as a social construct to determine who has resources and benefits and those that don't. And I'm going to compare that also, I'm going to intersect race in migration in terms of this country. As you probably well know, that as this country was being founded, different groups would come over. And it was like each group that came over, they'd have to start at the bottom.
Right.
Okay? And they would do the work that nobody else wanted to do.
Correct.
And they would not be embraced or accepted until they took on the values and the language of the American society. And oftentimes that ended up with folks changing their last name to sound more American, not allowed to speak their native language but to speak English in order to be able to transition into being American. That happened time and time again, and we understand that history and that legacy because that's how this country was founded. And in that process, as you began to acclimate to being an American, that afforded you opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise have because of not making that transition. The irony of it is that didn't apply to all groups because when it came time for that to happen for African Americans and people of a darker hue, that did not happen.
Correct.
There was a time when Italians were considered I won't use the epitaph, but you know where I'm going with that.
Yes.
And so we're the Irish, and,
Correct.
and, you know, and so on and so forth. So our country has a history of racializing people until they have transitioned or integrated. I can't think of the right word I'm looking for right now, because sometimes it happens with me. I can't pull the word when I want to. But until they've transitioned and being an American, they were not afforded the same privileges of those who already taken on the values and the language and the ways of this country.
Exactly. I mean, it's the call for assimilation.
Thank you. That's
which may or may not always be appropriate
Yes.
in many cases,
Yes.
because it's a denial of culture,
Right.
a denial of heritage,
Right.
and the creation of a hierarchical social structure.
Mm-hmm.
Just two final questions, and again, I appreciate so much your commentary.
You are most welcome. And thank you for pulling the word assimilation.
That's perfectly okay. You've had such an astute commentary, at least I can lend a word to it. One of the phrases that we have heard, particularly in the last year, but it has been historic in this nation, and that is the phrase systemic racism. How would you define that?
Systemic racism has to do with structures in which we abide by in this country that continues to perpetuate inequities. That's what systemic racism is, and it exists in almost every institution that exists in our country, whether we want to acknowledge that or not.
And I think acknowledging that is a key element. Certainly, we have seen it in financial institution lending policies.
I'm glad you brought that
Yes.
up, because I want to share this because it's relevant to that. I just saw a news report that was really disheartening, that on a personal story that's worth sharing. That was a woman in Florida, and her and her husband owned a home there, and they wanted to refinance. This was on the news just yesterday. She happened to be an African-American woman who was married to a Caucasian male, and they had children. And so she went and had her house appraised. And when the appraisal came back, they were disappointed. And she wondered, I'm wondering if it appraised low because of the fact that I'm African-American.
Certainly.
So what she did, her and her husband decided to remove any pictures in the house that showed her or her kids or her side of the family, and only her husband was in the home when a second appraiser came by. Okay? When the house was first appraised, it was appraised at $330,000. When the second appraisal was done, it was $440,000, a 40% increase. And at first she said she was excited about the fact that it got appraised higher, which meant that would benefit them financially. And then she got mad.
Then she got angry.
Yes.
Rightfully so.
Because she realized that in this society, being black is valued less.
That's a classic story and a primary example of systemic racism. Systemic racism that is based on the pictures in a home, the images that one sees when they walk through a door. That story tells it as well as anything else. As tragic as it is, it's the reality we need to face. And that leads to my final question. We are, and in fact the entire United Methodist Church is, participating in conversations on this, but it must be more than a conversation. We have had many years where we talk about we need to have a conversation on issues of social justice, on issues of change, transformation. What role do you see churches exercising in combating racism, systematic racism? The kind of stories that we now tell and are becoming too commonplace on the news, too commonplace in our lives. What role can churches exercise?
I'm going to leave the expertise of the religious morals and teachings to you, but what I will say to you is this. It's when I think of religion and what it's based on in terms of Jesus' teachings about how we are to treat people, in that I think is the answer to that. And if people abided by that, a lot of the issues that we're talking about now would not be issues. I think we have strayed from those basic tenets of religious beliefs that dictate how we ought to treat one another and how we ought to care for one another. And I think that we've fallen short. And I think making sure that that's the foundation of beginning these conversations, in my opinion, would be the place to start in a house of worship.
I think that's an excellent observation. Clearly, racism, racial injustice, systemic racism, prejudice based on the color of a person's skin is antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. And antithetical in such a strong way that it's violative of our basic Christian heritage, our Judeo-Christian heritage. I would just have a follow-up to that. Within the white community, there are always questions of that it's difficult to understand living within the role of a black American. Very difficult for a white person. And really to the point, can a white person truly empathize with the struggle of being persecuted, of having less privilege? That being the case, if we accept that as accurate, at least to some extent, how can the white community, particularly white individuals within churches, become co-travelers on this journey to racial justice?
I want to go back and answer, or add to an answer to a question you asked earlier as I respond to that.
Okay.
I think, first of all, the reason why it's hard to talk about race and racism as a white person is because there's a lot of guilt associated with that.
Yes.
And people become uncomfortable because it makes them feel uncomfortable, it makes them feel bad, like they've done something wrong, you know, like they in some way have harmed someone, harmed
Yes.
the people. So that's where the hesitancy comes from having the conversation. And then after the guilt comes anger, because no one likes to feel guilty.
Correct.
And therefore the conversation never really gets off the ground. I think what's really important is when beginning these conversations, it's so important to create a safe space for people to have these conversations, to let them know that it's okay to say what you feel and think, and you're not going to be judged. People are afraid of being judged.
Yes.
And the reality of it is that none of us are perfect. None of us have not been in a situation where we've had biased or prejudicial thoughts. We've all had them.
Exactly.
And to say that we haven't would not be honest. And I think that it requires us to be able to be a little bit vulnerable to have these kinds of conversations, and that's why it's important to be safe and to be open to hearing what other people have to say. And it's not to be listening to necessarily to agree or disagree,
Correct.
but to be listening for understanding. Just because I listen to your experience with police and it's not mine, that doesn't mean I'm going to change my attitude about police. But I want to understand why you believe what you believe.
Right.
What experiences have you had that have led you to that conclusion? Doesn't mean I'm going to change my perception, but it's not about me. It's about understanding where that person is coming from. So that really requires me to step out of sight of myself a bit, to join that other person and on their path for better understanding. Now, in the end, after having had that experience, I might make some changes in my views, or I might not. But that's not the purpose. The purpose is to seek understanding. And to seek understanding requires you to be able to listen, which is harder than we think.
It's
So
extremely,
really listen.
it's extremely difficult, but you're absolutely right. And I think if indeed there is a message for the churches, and you've captured it so well, I think that message is we have to create those brave spaces.
Yes.
We
Yes.
have to create those brave spaces where those kind of dialogues can occur that are not always geared toward consensus, but are geared toward valuing stories and finding the value in your story and you finding the value in my story. And perhaps they are markedly disparate stories, but we're valuing one another.
Correct. And that's the key. It's not agreeing or disagreeing. It's about appreciating and valuing the other person.
Absolutely, and I really think if I can marry or conjoin a couple of your comments, as we create these brave spaces, The guiding culture within the faith community must indeed be the teachings of Jesus. Within that construct, we then can have that grave space where your story is as valuable as mine, and the two stories, when coming face to face, need not merge, but need to be mutually respected.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lackey. You have been informative, enjoyable, and we hope that, that this is the beginning of many conversations on this very difficult topic. So again, I thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
I thank you for your presence, and if you would like any concluding words, the floor is yours.
I would just like to say, as you embark on having this conversation, be open, listen, and allow folks to be themselves, to listen without judgment, but compassion and genuineness. And in doing so, everyone that's a part of those conversations will be enriched by it.
Thank you so much.